from the mouth down the esophagus through the cardiac sphincter into the stomach we go. And the stomach is a pretty interesting structure. It does have some nuances to it. Excuse me. Some stuff that makes it unique. It has a number of cells within it. These cells are going to be very specific in what they secrete. They're going to comprise what is called the gastric glands. And the different cell types within this gastric gland is what's going to help create what is called gastric juice. Gastric just means stomach. That's it. Okay. Gastric just means stomach. And so it's these various different cells that comprise the gland that secrete all the various different things that are going to help us break down food stuff here within the stomach. As that bolus of food enters, it's kind of a big ball, a big mass of food. When it enters into the stomach and mixes with the digestive juices here, the gastric juice, within it, it becomes like a paste. And that's what chyme is, okay? So it enters as a bolus and it leaves as chyme. So these are just some terms that I have been using, bolus, and that I will use as we continue our journey throughout the rest of the digestive tract here, chyme. Really, the stomach is just a big muscular sac. It stores food. Okay, it stores it here for a certain period of time, and depending upon the nutritional profile of the food that you eat, depends on how long it stays in there. And it mixes the food. It mixes that bolus with the gastric juice. What is it? It's, there's mucus, okay? There's some hydrochloric acid, which mucus helps to buffer. There's some stuff called intrinsic factor and some various different enzymes. So all of this makes up this gastric juice, right? Gets just secreted into the stomach, and this is the fluid component of the stomach here. The different cells, as you can kind of see, there are 4 of them here. One of them is fantastically easy to remember what it does. 2 of them are really pretty easy to remember what they do. 2 of them sometimes get flip-flopped. Hint on the exam. You'll see these. I've asked it as both a multiple choice type question. I've asked it as an essay type question. So I've done it both different ways. You're going to see these dudes again in the next unit when we start talking about the macros, how we break down carbs, fats, and proteins. Okay. So you're going to see all these parts, all these players again in this unit exam. You're going to see them in the next unit exam. So again, understanding what these things do is going to be really important as we continue further on. So we have 4 different cells that make up this gastric gland. I think I have a picture of it in a couple slides from now. Mucus cells, parietal cells, chief cells, and I'll just use G cells. I'll try to use G cells, okay? G cells are a little bit, makes it really easy to remember. They're also referred to as enteroendocrine cells, as you can kind of see there. Entero means pertaining to the digestive system, and endocrine just tells you it's a hormone. G cells secrete gastrin. Gastrin starts with a G. Makes it super easy. Okay. Gastrin is a hormone. Excuse me, goodness. Gastrin is a hormone. You find these enteroendocrine cells, or these G cells, these G cells closer to the bottom of the gastric gland. Okay. Man, I can't get this map. The bottom of this gastric gland. Okay. Let's see, do I have a picture? Yeah, right there. Okay, there's your G cell. Here's just this invagination here of the mucosal lining here, and this is what makes up the gland. And here you can kind of see that G cell right there, okay? Your enteroendocrine cell is towards the bottom. Excuse me. This gastrin basically yells at everybody else to do more work. All right. It increases the secretions of the parietal cells. It increases the secretion of the chief cells. It's also going to affect mucus production as well, but parietal and chief cells are the big dudes here. All right. So G cells or enteroendocrine cells secrete gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone, and this helps to increase the secretion of more stuff: hydrochloric acid, pepsinogen, intrinsic factor. It also increases the motility, so there's going to be more kind of muscular action associated with the stomach. It's mixing that bolus of food with the gastric juice. All those enzymes interacting, helping us to break down food. Okay. So when I increase that motility, it increases that enzymatic mixing with the food stuff to break it down. G cells secrete gastrin. Gastrin starts with the letter G. Mucus cells secrete mucus. Fantastic, easy. Mucus does what you would think mucus does. It buffers. Okay, it buffers. Mucus lubricates, yes, but in this case, it's buffering. The pH of the stomach is around 2-ish. Okay, it's around 2-ish. pH of 2. Okay, we don't like it to get excessively low. Getting between 1 and 2 is kind of the area that we like to be in from a pH standpoint. If it becomes too acidic, stuff just doesn't work right. It breaks things down too much, can destroy things, and then we won't have anything to absorb within the small intestine. If it becomes too alkaline, too basic, it's just the opposite. Instead of being too effective in destroying things, we haven't broken things down enough. And so we like to kind of stay within a certain acidic range, and 1 to 2 is generally in that ballpark that the stomach likes to be in. This acidic content is what hydrochloric acid does. That's one of its functions. Okay, it helps to create the acidic environment to which the stomach functions within. Hydrochloric acid does 2 things. Hydrochloric acid helps us to break down proteins. So protein digestion begins here in the stomach. And it also helps to kill bacteria. Okay, so these are 2 functions of hydrochloric acid. We're obviously more concerned with this one because it's a macro. And we'll be talking about it here and in the next unit as well. Hydrochloric acid is secreted via the parietal cells. Okay. And here you can see, here's the parietal cell right here. Secretes a hydrogen ion, chloride ion, and together they form hydrochloric acid. There's a lot of physiology that goes into that, into this process here. If you're curious, take 210, okay? Because we go over this process about how we're able to get hydrogen ions and chloride ions into the cell, into the gastric juice, okay? Another thing that parietal cells secrete that's really important is called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is necessary for the absorption of vitamin B12. Okay. But absorption does not happen here in the stomach. Okay. Absorption happens in the small intestines. So if you do not produce enough intrinsic factor, your small intestines cannot absorb the proper amount of vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is kind of weird and unique, and we'll talk about it more in the when we talk about vitamins in the third unit. Okay? So we'll talk about it there, but for just a glimmer right now to kind of get an idea of what it does, its intrinsic factor attaches to vitamin B12, which facilitates me to remove vitamin B12 from the animal protein structure so I can absorb it. If I don't you're like, okay, so what? I don't absorb enough vitamin B12. This leads to pernicious anemia, which is one of the many different types of anemias that we have. But then if you don't have enough vitamin B12, then you don't make the proper red blood cells. And so you're going to be more tired and lethargic, which is pernicious anemia. You see it a lot in the elderly, intrinsic factor production dropping off. So parietal cells secrete two different things: hydrochloric acid, which helps us to break down proteins, and it also helps to kill bacteria, which can be in food if it's not cooked properly. Parietal cells also secrete intrinsic factor, which facilitates the absorption of vitamin B12. Our last cell we have, our fourth cell, is the chief cell. And the chief cell secretes pepsinogen. Pepsinogen plus hydrochloric acid makes pepsin. Okay? Makes pepsin. And this is what is going to be the specific enzyme that's helping us to break down amino acids, proteins. Okay? So yes, helps to break down proteins. It does that via activating pepsinogen to get me pepsin. So I've got mucus cells secreting mucus, buffering the high acidic content of the stomach, so I don't eat away at the lining of the stomach. Okay? If you have an ulcer, that's because you've interfered with the production of mucus, and now this acid material can eat away at that inner lining of the stomach. That's what an ulcer is. Parietal cells secrete two things: hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Hydrochloric acid helps us to break down proteins. Intrinsic factor, absorption of B12 in the small intestines. Chief cells secrete pepsinogen, which is an inactive enzyme. Pepsinogen mixes with the hydrochloric acid, and voila, I have pepsin. Pepsin breaks down proteins. The fourth and the last one are G cells. G cells secrete gastrin. It's a hormone. It tells everybody else to do more work, and it increases the motility of the stomach so I can mix all of that digestive juice, gastric juice, with that bolus of food that is entered into. The more food that enters into the stomach, the more G cells become active. Okay? Because think of it this way: as food enters into this gastric pit, okay, the stomach, as it enters into the stomach, the acid is going to become less and less. So I need to produce more and more and more hydrochloric acid to handle more and more food that's coming in. And again, mucus, pretty easy. G cells secreting gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone. It gets into the blood, and then the blood travels by all of these cells here, and that is what causes them all to stimulate their increase in their production. Okay. There's chief cells, pepsinogen, parietal cells, hydrochloric acid, and intrinsic factor. And again, hydrochloric acid mixes with pepsinogen and makes pepsin. So gastric glands, those are something that are very unique to the stomach. We don't find those dudes anywhere else. Another thing that is very unique when it comes to the stomach is a third layer of muscle. This third layer of muscle is called the oblique layer because it's at an oblique angle, just goes at an angle. We have our longitudinal muscle, just like we have throughout the whole dang thing. We have a circular layer of muscle, like we have throughout the whole dang thing. But here we have this third, okay? And this is what really allows us to churn up and mix that bolus of food with the digestive juices of the stomach. So you can really mash up that bolus and make it into a paste, right? Chyme. Excuse me. So this third layer of muscle is something that is only found here within the stomach. You don't find a third layer of muscle in the esophagus, small intestine, large intestine, rectum, nowhere else. The only place you see it is here within the stomach. Okay? No other spot. No other spot. Okay. Here's where food enters, this upper portion right here, and here's kind of the lower portion down through here. This is kind of where we're going here as we talk about here. This is where we get the mixing. Okay. This is where we get the mixing here. As we get down here, this is kind of where the stomach content kind of ultimately ends up. Pretty obvious, right? Enter and exit. But this is where we'll just kind of mix it a little bit here as well, as it's getting ready to be exited out into the small intestine. Okay. And here we call it chyme. We have the pyloric sphincter, the cardiac sphincter that regulates the entrance into the stomach. I have the pyloric sphincter that regulates the exit out of the stomach. How much, how long this stays open, I guess is probably the better way to say it, will depend on the nutritional profile of the food that you eat. Right? Hormones that get secreted in the small intestine influence that sphincter, influence how long it stays open, so I can, ooze out the chyme into the small intestine. And we'll talk about some of those. I can't remember if I talk about it today, but we'll talk about it in the next unit as well. Some of those enzymes and hormones that get secreted that influence this pyloric sphincter here. The stomach is interesting from a nervous system standpoint. As soon as you hear food or see food or smell food being made, it's going to start priming the engines. Okay. As soon as you see or hear or smell food being created, your mouth starts to water. Well, it's just digestive juices, right? The saliva is mixed with the stuff. So when food enters, wha-bam, I can start getting stuff active, start getting stuff initialized in their breakdown, right? Especially carbohydrates. But that can also start to happen in the stomach as well. You can start to increase your production of some of that stuff, hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor, yada, 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 by just sometimes seeing that food being prepared or smelling it or hearing it, okay? But really, peristalsis itself doesn't really start at all until food enters into it, okay? And that's what kicks off this breakdown, or I'm sorry, this mixing of food with the gastric juice. Not a whole heck of a lot of stuff is absorbed. As you can kind of see, few substances are absorbed. Alcohol is absorbed a little bit through the stomach. Certain lipid soluble compounds can be absorbed in this fashion here in the stomach. But aspirin can be absorbed here in the stomach. So not a whole heck of a lot of stuff can, but there are a few things. They're all kind of lipid-based substances that can be absorbed. But this is where protein and fat is broken down. Okay, carbohydrate, we started that up mechanically and chemically in the mouth with salivary amylase. Here in the stomach is where we start to see the breakdown of proteins and fats. Okay, lingual lipase, inactive in the mouth, gets down here in the stomach, mixes with that high acid content, the hydrochloric acid, and it kickstarts that enzymatic activity. So fat breakdown starts here as well for the most part. Protein, again, broken down here as well because of pepsin and hydrochloric acid. But there is your kind of range. There's your pH range. Okay. About 2 to 1 is kind of the sweet spot. Okay, as you can kind of see. Acidic, what an acidic solution is, to me, it seems pretty obvious, but if you're not a science person, maybe it's not. Something acidic has a pH below 7, and something is alkaline with a pH higher than 7. Okay. So again, we try to keep the gastric juice kind of within that 1 to 2 ballpark, but here's the normal range. Okay, you get it above 3, very alkaline, very basic. Okay, very alkaline, very basic, and you won't be able to break down stuff effectively at all. Okay, which makes absorption in the small intestine difficult. You can have some pretty significant malnutrition because of that. If you get the gastric juice lower than 0.9, you can have an issue where you denature, you destroy the protein too much. And if you destroy the protein too much, you won't be able to utilize it. Okay? It's not usable by the body. So we have this little range that we like to keep it in, and to have digestion and absorption be effective as it is. All right. There's that lingual lipase there, there it says becoming active. I think I've said it like 3 different times now. It's something that people generally forget. That's why I say it so many times. But we also have salivary amylase. That was released as a component there with saliva in the mouth. When salivary amylase gets secreted there, it initializes some carbohydrate breakdown. Not a whole hell of a lot, but a little bit happens. As this is traveling through the esophagus, salivary amylase is doing its thing. Okay? But as soon as it enters into the stomach and as soon as it plops into that high acid content, you destroy the enzyme. So carbohydrate digestion really stops within the stomach. Okay. Mucus is there to protect. Okay, so really nothing new there. Here we go. How long does food stay in the stomach? About 4 hours. Okay, and that can vary quite a bit, but generally on average, it's about 4 hours. Okay. Higher carb content, your body, doesn't have to do a whole heck of a lot of stuff. Fiber slows it down. Or I'm sorry, slows it down quite a bit. Protein, a high protein based meal, that's going to cause food to kind of stay within the stomach a little bit longer, but definitely higher fat can cause it to be slowed down as well, and that's just because of what's going to happen within the small intestine when it comes to fat breakdown. So the nutritional profile, as I always say, of a meal can vary how fast it goes through your digestive tract. So you can kind of see if you eat a lot more carbs, pretty fast through the digestive tract compared to any of the other macros. And obviously the size of the meal. If you eat a really, really large meal, obviously that takes more time and effort to break down. So stuff can stay in there in the stomach a little bit longer. So if you have a really large meal that's high in fat, I mean, it could be there for a really long, slightly longer period of time. Okay. And again, it kind of varies a little bit by the time, but 4 hours is the average. Sometimes I ask that. If I ask it, it's going to be multiple choice. But definitely when it comes to stuff that can affect the meal size, so I wouldn't necessarily, I might ask it as a essay question based on, maybe dealing with something, discussing the stomach or whatnot. If I was to do that, it'd probably be in the next unit, to be honest, when I can start adding the macros a little bit more into it and adding more in-depth type of questions here. If it empties too rapidly, I think the book goes into it. It causes a disorder called dumping syndrome, when the chyme flows too quickly from the stomach into the small intestine. I just find it's just a funny name. Okay? Eventually it causes another funny name called diarrhea. So Here's the condition associated with the stomach here, and I have a nice little picture here. Here's a picture right there. Okay. Here's the esophagus. Here you can kind of see this is the redness here. Down here, this is the slight little erosions that have occurred in this mucosal lining right here. There's the stomach. The pink, the lighter pink is the normal color. But that redness there, that shows you some of the acid reflux that has occurred. And it's just eating away at the lining, causing that kind of traditional damaged redness appearance there to it. Gastroesophageal reflux is heartburn, okay? This is the fancy name. There's the street name, I guess, for lack of a better word. This is when that acid content goes backwards through the system. Again, the esophagus is not really designed to handle that huge acid content. Yes, there's mucus cells, okay? But there's not that much mucus cells compared to what's in the stomach. There's a whole heck of a lot of them there. Repeated heartburn can eventually lead to what is called GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD. Chronic means long-term. Okay, chronic means long-term. Okay, this is years, long-term. Okay. This is years. Okay, 10 years if you want to add a number to it. Okay, so that's a long time. Okay, something acute, very quick, very recent, chronic, over a long period of time. Okay, so if you have repeated bouts of heartburn, repeated bouts of gastroesophageal reflux, and you take a little bit of something, whenever you have that, you do occasional. But if your occasional is every single day, that adds up. And if you're talking about every single day or every other day for several years on end, you get a change in this tissue type. Right? And even though this doesn't really look like anything, like something that's really bad, eventually you can cause this type of tissue to become different. Tissue adapts to its environment. Okay? You see it with smokers, okay? Where we get a change in tissue type because of environmental conditions here. And that can be a prelude to cancer potentially later on in life as well. So if you have repeated bouts of heartburn, get it checked out, okay? Sometimes it's just the foods that you're eating. Some factors that contribute it. Excess body fat is the number one. Okay? And this has to go to, eating just a lot of food and a lot of content being within the stomach. And so, so you can kind of see, overeating. This is acidic foods. I guess I should just kind of put it like that. Acidic foods. Okay. Eating greasy foods, spicy foods, peppermint, chocolate, all of these things aggravate the stomach, cause it to produce a much larger amount of hydrochloric acid, which again contributes to even worsening heartburn. Alcohol, coffee, again, some are just stuff that are acidic. Actually, secondhand smoke can do it as well, or smoking as well can exacerbate heartburn as well. So, excess body fat, overeating the wrong things. There's a number of different factors that can contribute to heartburn and worsening heartburn as well. Pregnant women, common thing is to have, some heartburn. That's just because sphincters loosen up, muscles loosen up as the growing creature inside is taking up space, pushing up on the stomach, which opens up that cardiac sphincter a little bit more. And so heartburn is going to be, pretty common in pregnant women. Get rid of the said creature and then the heartburn goes away generally. What could you do to reduce your risk? Well, really the biggest one is lose excess body weight. Okay, that's kind of the big one. Avoid smoking. Don't overeat. This one's pretty interesting. Don't lie down for 3 hours. This just ensures that if you eat and then lay down, I mean, gravity, as I'm standing here talking, the food that I just ate, during the break there, I mean, gravity along with peristalsis is helping to slowly move that food down through my esophagus, right? Well, if I lay down, gravity is not pulling it down to the esophagus, right? So now it's just peristalsis. So if you have that phenomena going on as it's kind of, as you're laying down and it's oozing into the stomach, it's just going to ooze a little bit, and you could get a backwash of acid content coming up into your esophagus a lot. For people who suffer from heartburn, excessive heartburn, repeated heartburn bouts, that's the major thing that they tell them not to do. They tell them not to lie down for 3 hours. There's also some medications as well that tell you not to lie down for after immediately taking the medication, and it kind of eats away at the lining of the esophagus. So that's the concept for that as well. So don't lay down. Elevate the head so it's about 6 to 8 inches higher. Again, this just ensures that gravity and peristalsis can move that thing down. Don't wear a tight belt, or don't wear pants that are too tight. That's a very common one. I know the stomach's up here and the belt should be down a little further. I get it, but if you cinch up that belt, or you have pants that are way too tight for you, that affects other anatomy, which affects how stuff connects it out of the stomach at the proper time. So that's why that one's in there as well. Eat smaller meals. You can eat smaller meals. That would be another way that you can combat heartburn. If you are somebody who does suffer from it and you done a number of different things and nothing seems to work, eating smaller portion sizes, that is something that can also be done as well for the individual. We can have ulcers happen within the esophagus. They're referred to as esophageal ulcers. Very not good. You can also have them within the stomach. Not good either, but here they are referred to as a peptic ulcer. Peptic is referring to stomach. You can also get a sore within the tissue within the duodenum. That would be called a duodenal ulcer. So you can have it happen in the esophagus, you can have it happen in the stomach, or you can have it happen within the first segment of the small intestine, the duodenum. This is just a solitary lesion that we saw. This is the solitary lesion, the damaged part. Okay. If it's happening within the stomach, it's eroding a part of that innermost lining there, that mucosal lining there. And these are just some symptoms: dull upper abdominal pain, deep. I don't know what that. It feels like it's just going through you. Somebody's boring a hole through you. That's generally how people describe it. Feeling of fullness for upwards of 2 hours after eating. You're really swollen and inflamed with this. Some factors: non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. That's probably the most common one. An alcoholic, excessive amounts of alcohol consumption. I mean, you don't have to be an alcoholic if you go on a bender on a weekend with your friends. That's a large amount of alcohol being consumed that can cause a potential ulcer as well. You see a lot in college age students. Okay? But one of the biggest factors associated with peptic ulcers, not just NSAIDs or alcohol or smoking, but it is an infection with Helicobacter pylori, and just H. pylori is fine with me, okay, to remember. H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori, is a bacteria that most people have, everybody has within their stomach. And it's just hanging out there. It's helping us to do a few things. But for some reason, H. pylori H. pylori within the stomach can proliferate in numbers excessively in some individuals. And there's a ton of research, and we don't know why. We don't know why. But it is a major cause for peptic ulcers worldwide when you look at it. NSAIDs are there because this interferes, this limits, let's write this here, limits mucus production. That's why you don't want to do too much. Here's what H. pylori looks like. As you can kind of see there, there's medications, there's antibiotics that you can do to help reduce the stomach acid content. Again, it's bacteria, and that's what hydrochloric acid will do, right? Helps to kind of kill off bacteria. But we don't know why this little bacteria can be in most of us in this classroom right now and not cause any issues at all. And for those that have excessive bouts of Helicobacter pylori type of infections, it is a massive cause, and there is a ton of medication that those individuals can take. But they've done a ton of research on this little bacteria right here to try to figure out why it affects some people more than others. We just don't know. But it's pretty interesting, some of the just the sheer amount of research that's out there when it comes to this little bacteria that is found in the vast majority of all people.